Night shifts can be eerie. Most nights, they're just a blur of fast food runs and sleepy-eyed customers. But some nights, the darkness hides something much more sinister. That Saturday, as I clocked in for my usual rideshare shift, I expected the typical chaos of late-night cravings and hurried deliveries. But the moment I accepted an order for a guy named Alex, everything changed. A house at the end of a dead-end road, a shadowy figure waiting for his food, and a stench, a smell that clung to the air like a warning. The longer I stayed, the more I realized this wasn't just another delivery. And whatever Alex was hiding in the darkness of his house, I was about to find out. I work as a rideshare driver at night to make a little extra cash. Friday and Saturday nights are always the busiest since everyone is either at home or with friends, ordering food. So, those were usually the nights I would work. One Saturday night, at around 1 a.m., I got a request to pick up McDonald's for a guy named Alex. He lived a few minutes away from my current location, so I entered the nearest McDonald's into the app, which was only a 2-minute drive away, and picked up his order. It was small, just 2 hamburgers. Alex's house was about 5 to 7 minutes away from the McDonald's. I followed the app's directions and eventually ended up on a short dead-end street that branched off another dead-end street. His house was the last one on this road, right next to a line of trees that ran alongside a highway. It was very quiet at this hour, given how late it was. Not wanting to ring the bell, I called Alex's number. It rang once and then went to voicemail, so I hung up. Shortly after, I got a text from him, telling me to come to the door. So I did. I got to the large wooden front porch of the house, and soon the door opened. A bald man answered. He didn't look very old, probably in his 30s, yet his head was completely bald. Maybe he was sick or just liked the look. I didn't judge. However, his breath was terrible, and he seemed quite drunk, which was a little unsettling. Payments were processed through the app, so there usually wasn't any need to wait around for money. But this time, Alex asked me to come inside and put the food on his kitchen table while he fetched a tip. I didn't mind the prospect of free money, so I waited in the kitchen, which was dimly lit by a small outlet-sized nightlight. The whole room smelled terrible, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. Alex was taking an awfully long time down in the basement, presumably looking for a tip, so I began to wander a bit. I stepped into the living room, which was adjacent to the kitchen. The TV was on, which was the only reason I could see anything in the room. However, the stench was even stronger in this room. Then, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. Maybe he was airing out whatever that putrid odor was. I walked over to the back door, expecting to get a quick breath of fresh air, but the smell only worsened. Finally, I stepped outside onto the man's back deck and heard flies, the unmistakable sound of a swarm right by the door. Then, a motion-sensing light detected my movement and switched on, revealing 2 large black garbage bags stuffed with long, bulky objects. The smell was unbearable. It took me a moment to realize what I was most likely looking at. Suddenly, waiting around for the tip didn't seem like a good idea anymore. I quickly went back inside and rushed to the front door. Just then, I heard Alex emerge from the basement, calling to me while holding a few singles in his hand. He saw me as I was about to open the door and asked where I was going. I had to think fast, so I said I was just running to my car to check if I had forgotten something. "Oh, okay," he said, as he came over and handed me the bills. Then, he turned towards the back door leading to the porch, where the light was still on. He looked back at me, and his smile, gummy and unsettling, disappeared. In a firm voice, he asked if I had gone to his backyard. I lied and told him no, and he just stared at me in silence. At that point, I didn't care anymore. I opened the door and stepped outside, but not before he grabbed my shoulder as I got onto the stoop. I yanked his hand off and bolted to my car. As I got inside, I saw him rush back into his house, leaving the front door wide open. I turned on my car and sat there, watching his front door, curious to see if he'd come back out, and he did. He came running full speed toward my car, wielding a big metal rod. I floored the gas pedal and sped away from his house, ready to call the police and report him. I made the call as soon as I got down the block, making sure to leave him no time to dispose of whatever, or whoever, was inside those bags. Within 2 minutes, police cars pulled up to the scene, and I watched it all unfold as I gave the officers directions to the house. Alex, if that was even his real name, and had already started moving the bags, which did contain dead bodies, to the bushes in his backyard. Everything about this guy was off. Exposing dead bodies to a pizza delivery driver might have made him deranged, but it also meant he wasn't the smartest person around. I deliver food for an Asian eatery in my town. It's the best gig I could get at my age, simply because of the tips. My friend and I work there together, and we're actually the only two who aren't Asian. My friend usually handles the counter and phone calls, while I take care of deliveries, which is how I prefer it. One night, during our shift together, my friend got off the phone and informed me that I'd be doing a delivery after the food was prepared. Once the order was ready, they handed me a brown paper bag, and I set off. The address led me to a small dirt driveway off the main road, onto an enclosed property. Don't imagine it as some fancy, private place, though. It was an old, neglected property, with not a single light on and overgrown grass. The house looked abandoned. I called my friend back at the restaurant, who passed the phone to our boss. Unfortunately, our boss can be a bit of a grouch, and in his thick accent, he yelled at me to knock on the door and not waste the food. So, I got out of my car, feeling the tall grass brush against my shins, and walked up the 3 steps to the front door. I knocked loudly since there was no doorbell. After waiting about 30 seconds, I received no answer. I headed back to my car and started texting my friend at the restaurant. But then, when I glanced back at the house, I noticed that one of the upstairs lights had turned on. So, I decided to try again. I walked back to the door and knocked once more. This time, just as I knocked, the door pushed open slightly. Someone had cracked it open, but there was no one standing there. I pushed the door a bit further and called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the empty house, and I waited for any sound in response. Footsteps came to the door, but they never did. Obviously, someone had to have opened the door. So if they weren't coming to meet me, I assumed they wanted me to come inside. I stepped into the house, and my shoes creaked against the wooden floor. I called out once more, and this time, someone replied. I heard the words, a key, arriba. Now, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I knew that a key meant here, and arriba meant above, so I figured they were saying up here. There was a stairway in the middle of the hallway, so I walked over to it and stopped at the bottom step. I looked up and saw an arm at the top of the stairs, just reaching out over the ledge, motioning stiffly as if to say, "Come here." Using what little Spanish I remembered from middle school, I said something like, "Tengo tu comida," meaning I have your food, as I began to walk up the stairs. But when I was about halfway up, the arm was gone. I got to the top of the stairs, looking around for whoever had just been standing by the ledge. Then, I noticed, through a sliver of light, that the person was now inside a bedroom with the lights off. I couldn't see them clearly, just their arm again, repeating that eerie, "come here" motion. It was as if everything above their elbow faded into the darkness of the room. The sight was so unsettling, and I knew for certain I wasn't going in that room. Standing my ground, I said firmly and confidently, "Buddy, I'm not going in there. You come out here with the money or I leave." Suddenly, the arm jerked back into the shadows of the room, and after a few tense seconds of standing there in silence, I was suddenly hit by a flying object. It all happened so fast that it took me a moment to realize I'd just been struck by a stiff, severed arm. And this wasn't some cheap plastic Halloween prop, it was a real arm. In shock and horror, I bolted down the stairs, still clutching the food bag in my hand, and sprinted back to my car. I didn't even bother to call my friend or my boss. I just drove straight to the nearest neighboring house and rang their doorbell. When a woman answered, I told her what had just happened at her neighbor's house. She gave me the most puzzled look, and then she said something that made my stomach drop. Nobody had lived in that house for a year. Her words hit me like a brick. We spoke for about 5 minutes, and she assured me she would call the police to report the incident. Afterward, I returned to the restaurant, still in shock with the uneaten food. I explained the situation to my boss as best as I could, and he surprisingly let it go. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped into that room, and who, or what, I would have found waiting for me. I used to work at Domino's, which closes at 3 a.m. on weekends. At the time of this story, I was taking a gap year during college, So my boss often threw me on the 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. shifts. Usually, at least 3 people worked that late. One to cook the pizzas, one to take orders, and one to handle deliveries. That night, the one making the pizzas was Finn, a 28-year-old Italian guy working 2 jobs. He was always in a bad mood, so when he told me to make a delivery, I did it without complaints. Being a Saturday night, it wasn't unusual to get orders for deliveries past 2 a.m. Around 2:30, I was given 2 pizzas to deliver to an address I still vaguely remember, something like 27 Crocker Drive. I took my old, beat-up 2000 Honda Civic and drove up the main road for about 5 minutes. This road was the only main route cutting through our tiny town in the Manchester Township area of New Jersey, which is mostly just endless trees and darkness. After merging off the main road onto smaller streets with no streetlights, the only source of light for miles around were my headlights. I turned off the public road onto a dirt path with a private property sign posted outside. It seemed I had arrived at the house I was delivering to. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang that echoed through my car, followed by a weakened sense of handling and a repeated flopping sound. I knew immediately that I had just gotten a flat tire. I pulled over to the side and got out to confirm my suspicion. The front right tire was completely flat. Through the glow of my headlights, I could see the house wasn't far from my car, so instead of calling my insurance company, I figured I'd deliver the pizzas and ask the homeowner for help. I walked up to the deck of the house. It was an average-sized place, completely surrounded by trees, like most houses in this area. The lights were on inside, but all the blinds were shut. I rang the doorbell, and a normal-looking young man answered quickly. Before exchanging the pizzas for money, I explained my predicament to him. A look of concern crossed his face as he handed me the cash and I gave him the pizzas. He then offered to come outside and take a look at my car with me. It was about a 30-second walk from the house. When we reached my car, he started examining the tire and told me he could help but would need to grab some tools from inside. As he walked back towards his house, I started to question what I could have hit on his dirt driveway. He yelled back to me, "Don't worry about it." But as I kept walking down the road a bit further, ignoring his shout, I spotted something on the ground, a spike strip. It was small, but it was unmistakably what had caused my flat tire. I couldn't see any other reason for that to be there other than him putting it there deliberately. My mind raced through the possibilities of what could be happening. I decided to play it cool, pretending I hadn't seen the spike strip. I walked back toward him, saying I didn't find anything. He glanced at me, and for a moment, I worried he might suspect that I knew something. But then he simply turned away and said he was going inside to get some tools. God only knows what he meant by tools. I waited for him to reach his front door before I quickly got back in my car, turned it on, and threw it into reverse. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what he was really up to. The flat tire wobbled on the dirt road as I slowly rolled backward, making sure to avoid the spike strip this time. As soon as I got back onto the concrete road, I took one last look down the driveway to make sure he wasn't following me. Then I took off, but I couldn't drive too fast for fear of damaging my wheel, so I kept my speed steady at 10 to 15 miles per hour. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, my heart dropped. There he was, the man, chasing after my car. I had no choice but to step on the gas, forcing myself to cringe at the damage I could feel being done to my wheel. Luckily, the gap between my car and the man grew wider until he eventually disappeared from sight after I turned onto the main road I had come from. I slowed down again to 10 to 15 miles per hour for the 20-minute drive back, painfully aware of how long it would take at that speed. When I finally got back to Domino's, the place was closing in 10 minutes. I still had to return the delivery sign they make us put on our cars. Finn was upset that I took so long, but his expression changed to shock when I recounted the entire story. The other worker who was on shift with us listened intently, eyes wide and horrified. As closing time came around, Finn suggested I just drive home slowly since I live nearby and could take care of the tire issue the next day. He and the other worker got into their cars and drove away. I sat in my car for a bit, processing what had just happened. Eventually, I turned on the engine and began my slow drive home. However, I noticed that a car without its lights on was following closely behind me for a while. Trying to confirm my suspicions, I pulled over in front of a small house to see if they would do the same. The car passed me, but then pulled over to the side of the street a little further down. I started to panic, convinced it was the man who had tracked me down from the Domino's he ordered from. I couldn't risk leading him to my house, so even though I wasn't certain it was him, I knew I had to be overly cautious and call the cops. I gave the police my exact location, fearing that I was being followed. After about 5 to 10 minutes of waiting, a police car slowly rolled down the street. I beeped my horn to signal the officer, who then stopped and reversed until our windows were lined up. We both rolled them down, and I pointed toward the car in front of me, its lights still off, sitting further down the street. Just then, the car I was pointing to sped away, lights still off, and vanished into the darkness of the road. The officer immediately flipped on his lights and raced after the car without saying a word. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to follow them, but with my damaged tire, I couldn't anyway. I drove home as quickly as possible and parked my car in the driveway, heart pounding. To this day, I don't know if that cop ever caught the driver. Something tells me he didn't, but I like to imagine he did. Either way, that night changed everything for me. After that, I always watched my back every time I drove home, and I quit that delivery job 2 months later. That night haunted me long after it ended. Every drive home, every shadow in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone out there knowing where I lived. The truth is, it wasn't just about delivering pizzas. It was about a moment that changed how I saw the world, a moment that made me realize how fragile a sense of safety can be. I quit that job 2 months later, not just out of fear, but out of a newfound respect for life and how quickly it can be upended. I may never know if that man was caught or what his intentions truly were, but one thing is for certain. That night taught me to trust my instincts, to value the present, and to never take my safety for granted. Sometimes, it's not just about surviving a scary encounter. It's about learning to live differently after it, holding on to the little things that keep us grounded. Because sometimes, those little things are the only anchors we have in a world full of uncertainty.